Hello and welcome. We will be beginning our webinar in just a few moments as everyone starts to join us. Hello and welcome. We'll be beginning our webinar in just a few moments as everyone starts to join us. Hello and welcome to our webinar about what is in the climate scoping plan for buildings. We will start our webinar in just a moment. So welcome to our seminar entitled What is in the Climate Scoping Plan for Buildings? We will be taking a deeper dive into the buildings chapter of the climate scoping plan. This was finalized and adopted this past December by the Climate Action Council. I'm Peck Kelleher. I'm the Deputy Director at the Alliance for Clean Energy New York. And many of you joining us today are members of ACE New York, and some of you are not. So let you know a little bit about ACE New York. The Alliance for Clean Energy New York is a member-driven and mission-based organization. Our mission is to promote clean energy in New York State, and our members are companies that are engaged in the distributed and grid-scale solar, wind, offshore wind, energy efficiency and building retrofits, hydroelectricity power and fuel cells, energy storage and transmission, electric vehicle manufacturers and charging infrastructure, plus environmental, consulting, labor, and academic organizations. And we are the voice of clean energy industry in New York State. I do have a few logistical announcements before we get started. The slides will be available and shared with those who have registered. And the webinar is being recorded and it will be shared with those that registered, and it will also be posted on the ACE New York website. If you would like to ask any questions, please type it into the Q&A function that you see on the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can do this during the presentation or at the very end. We will try to get through as many questions as we can at the end of the presentations by our panelists. ACE New York has been an active participant in the development of this plan, and as were thousands of other state residents. And we want to ensure that legislators, government leaders, civic organizations, environmental groups, and ordinary New Yorkers know what is in the climate scoping plan and what is not in the plan. We did have a seminar in January that was an overview of what's in the plan, and that is available on our website if you want to watch that one. Today, we are taking a deeper dive into the buildings chapter of the plan, and we are planning to hold 2 more seminars that will take a deeper dive on the electricity and transportation chapters of the plan later this month. So I thought we'd jump right in with our first speaker. Vanessa Ulmer is the lead policy advisor on the development team. And she was also a member of the staff team that supported the Climate Action Council in developing the plan. And Vanessa is going to walk us through a number of the pieces of the building chapter. Vanessa?
Thanks, Deb. How's my audio? Great. Okay, good morning, everyone. So I did drop in some of the overview slides of the Climate Action Council process that team from NYSERDA had the opportunity to speak with ACE New York members about in January, as Deb mentioned. I'm going to go through those very quickly, and then we'll get into the deep dive on the building sector. So next slide, please. So just a reminder that New York State has passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which I'll refer to as the Climate Act, with nation-leading commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, below 1990 levels, to make significant investments in clean energy technologies across large-scale renewables, distributed solar, energy storage, and building efficiency and electrification, and then really critical commitments to climate justice and just transition as we tackle this transformation of our energy system and economy. Next slide, please. Here, I do want to provide the framing up front that the buildings sector accounts for nearly a third of the direct greenhouse gas emissions in New York State. And that third that you see on the graphic on the left is from fossil fuel combustion, fossil fuels burned in buildings, primarily for space heating and water heating. Also upstream emissions that are associated with those fossil fuels, and some HFCs are included in that 32% hydrofluorocarbons in building products. What's not included is the electricity that's used in our building sector. That's in its own wedge here. So when we look at direct emissions from buildings and the indirect emissions from electricity that's used in buildings, buildings account for over 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in our state. Next slide, please. We really need to decarbonize the building sector in order to decarbonize our economy. And the Climate Act provides strategies to get there. The Climate Act required issuance of a scoping plan, which, as Deb mentioned, was issued in December of 2022 to point towards how we're going to reach these statutory emissions limits. So we're very grateful for years of diligent work by members of the Climate Action Council, which included Ann Reynolds of ACE New York, and multiple advisory panels, a Just Transition Working Group, a Climate Justice Working Group, and thousands of comments from members of the public, both in public hearings and in written comments. Next slide, please. So key findings from analysis that is a touchstone of our Climate Action Council scoping plan are noted here. So analytic work that analyzes pathways towards deep decarbonization across the New York State economy does find that achieving deep decarbonization is feasible by 2050, and it will require action in all sectors of the economy. Energy efficiency and end-use electrification are essential in any pathway to meet these deep decarbonization commitments. We'll speak more about that with respect to the building sector today. And the cost of inaction, the analysis found, exceeds the cost of action. So when we look at the benefit cost analysis, taking into account the value of avoided greenhouse gas emissions, the health benefits that will come with this plan, we find that the benefits do outweigh the costs. And that's not even accounting for the hundreds of thousands of jobs that will be created in addition to the economic and health benefits. Next slide, please. Climate justice, as I mentioned, is central to the scoping plan, and the Climate Act requires that at least 35%, with a goal of 40% of the benefits of New York spending on clean energy will be directed to disadvantaged communities, which are areas burdened by cumulative environmental pollution and other hazards that compromise the health and leave residents of those communities especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. And then another fundamental objective is to make sure that we have a just transition so that we are ensuring new economic development opportunities across the state and just and equitable transition paths for New York's workers. Next slide, please. So the scoping plan does include strategies in all sectors of the economy, and then today we are going to focus in on the building sector. Next slide, please. And here, actually, one more slide ahead. So we're going to go to slide 12, please. All right, awesome. So when we look about the building sector, let me see. I'm sorry, slide 12. We recognize that decarbonizing the building sector requires rapid and widespread energy efficiency upgrades and building electrification. And I'm going to pause for just a moment. Perfect. Thank you. The plan emphasizes the importance of energy efficient building envelopes, which are buildings that have good air sealing, insulation, and windows paired with good ventilation. And this makes buildings comfortable and healthier for occupants, saves on energy bills, and then also gets the building ready for electrification and allows the building to reduce the size of its heating and cooling system, such as a heat pump, making that system lower cost and having less impact on our electric grid. We'll be talking today about heat pumps, since high efficiency heat pumps are the most practical option today to decarbonize space and water heating. And heat pumps will provide heating, cooling, and hot water, and are able to do so today in most types of New York buildings. And I think my fellow panelists will touch on today options that include cold climate air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps. Thermal energy networks are another type of heat pumps that network across multiple buildings that are called out within the scoping plan. The scoping plan does note that electrification can be supported by the strategic utilization of alternative fuels. For example, using a cold climate air source heat pump plus a small amount of a renewable fuel for supplemental heating is a way to meet heating needs at very cold temperatures in the northern parts of the state. Other parts of the plan that are emphasized for decarbonizing the building sector include reducing embodied carbon associated with building construction through building reuse and lower carbon or carbon sequestering materials, and moving towards low and ultra low global warming potential refrigerants and alternatives to hydrofluorocarbons or HFCs. So the scoping plan outlines 4 themes that encompass key strategies to enable building decarbonization, and I will speak to each of those themes briefly today. But first, I want to ask you to go back one slide, Nate, to slide 11, to provide a vision of where we need to be by 2030, just 7 years away, and by 2050. So by 2030, the plan points to 1 to 2 million homes and 10 to 20% of commercial space in New York State using heat pumps for primary space heating and cooling. In the year 2030, heat pumps would need to be the majority of new purchases for space heating and water heating, which means that hundreds of thousands of new and existing homes and commercial buildings would be adopting a heat pump and efficiently electrifying from the year 2030 and each year thereafter. And this rapid market growth is predicted to generate a significant number of jobs, more than 100,000 new jobs in energy efficiency and clean heating and cooling. So we're going from heat pumps as a nascent part of our HVAC market now to the solution within the next 7 years. If we meet that goal and keep up the pace, by 2050, the plan points to 85% of homes and commercial buildings statewide, being efficiently electrified and using a diverse mix of high efficiency heat pumps, air source and ground source based and thermal energy networks. Zero emission buildings becoming the most cost effective option in a clean energy economy that supports secure jobs and demonstrates leadership and innovation by that mid-century mark. And by 2050, looking towards New York State having advanced a managed phase and just transition away from reliance on fossil fuels in buildings to a clean energy system, and doing so in a manner that supports vibrant, healthy communities and addresses and repairs structural inequalities in our economy. All right, so now we're going to go to slide 13, please. So looking at some of the highlighted building recommendations, the first theme is to adopt zero emission codes and standards and to require energy benchmarking for buildings. So adopting advanced state codes for new construction would require all new construction, as well as major renovations and alterations in buildings that are subject to code, to be highly efficient and to incorporate resilience features starting in 2025. So resilience features and efficiency features include buildings with high performance envelopes, electric and EV readiness, and on-site solar wherever feasible. In addition, a zero emission code, as recommended in the scoping plan, would prohibit fossil fuel combustion equipment for space conditioning, hot water, cooking, and appliances in new construction starting in 2025 for single family and low-rise residential buildings that are up to 3 stories in height, and starting in 2028 for multifamily buildings with 4 or more stories, and for commercial buildings. These policies towards having advanced codes seize upon the opportunity to build better buildings, buildings that are more comfortable, sustainable, and resilient at a minimum cost premium when efficient, integrated design practices are used in new construction. Now, we are in the midst of New York's legislative session and budget negotiations, and I believe my fellow panelists will speak to this as well. Governor Hochul and both the New York State Assembly and the Senate have proposed legislation to put the recommendation for highly efficient zero emission new construction codes into action. One kind of weedy point about the governor's proposal is that her proposal also addresses the need for alignment between the state's energy code and uniform code to ensure that the suite of codes aligns with the Climate Act goals. And this is certainly an important opportunity for legislative partnership as well as public engagement going forward through the Codes Council. Another recommendation to highlight here is to adopt standards for zero emission equipment. This recommendation focuses more on existing buildings where it tends to be most cost effective to make upgrades at common events in a building's life cycle, such as at the building sale or when it's time to replace equipment. The recommendation calls for phasing out fossil fuel equipment of residential size heating and hot water equipment starting in 2030, and then of commercial size heating and hot water equipment in 2035. And the scoping plan also addresses the replacement of cooking and clothes drying appliances starting in 2035. In Governor Hochul's legislative package to advance building decarbonization, she's included a proposal for the phase out of fossil fuel space heating and water heating equipment specifically. And for both the proposals that I mentioned regarding codes and equipment standards, the legislative proposals do include regulatory processes that would examine what types of exemptions may be appropriate, for example, for backup power, manufacturing processes, and other critical infrastructure. Finally, on this point, in terms of code standards and other regulatory requirements, is a recommendation to require energy benchmarking and disclosure, starting with buildings larger than 10,000 square feet, and to require those buildings to report on their energy consumption and water consumption to inform decisions on upgrades and performance standards. This does require enabling legislation, which the governor also has proposed in her package this year. Next slide, please. And I do need to pick up the pace here, I can see. So I will do that. So the second theme in the scoping plan buildings chapter is to scale up public financial incentives for building decarbonization. So we recognize that to reduce the upfront costs of these investments and accelerate adoption, incentives are important for solutions like building weatherization and high efficiency heat pumps. The plan points to prioritizing dedicated financial support programs for low and moderate income households, affordable and public housing, and residents in disadvantaged communities to enable these New Yorkers to make clean energy upgrades that improve housing quality and really pay attention to affordability. It's very important, and this is something that the Climate Justice Working Group emphasized, that the scoping plan also emphasizes, to couple regulatory investment, to couple public investment with regulatory protections so that LMI households are protected from threats to affordability or displacement in their communities. And my fellow panelists will share some additional information about incentives that are available in the New York State market today, and we can also discuss more in the Q&A portion. A second strategy addressed in the scoping plan is to expand access to low-cost financing, including supporting the expansion and creation of financing products to fund building upgrades and zero emissions equipment purchases. One thing I want to note that's in this bucket of recommendations where the state is making rapid strides is a recommendation to integrate clean energy requirements and resources directly into affordable housing deals. So the New York State Homes and Community Renewal did issue sustainability guidelines last spring that demonstrate this type of leadership, and Homes and Community Renewal and NYSERDA, as well as local housing agencies, are working in partnership to provide incentives for building decarbonization directly into affordable housing deals. Additionally, the scoping plan speaks to the importance of supporting development of thermal energy networks, where we're really pointing to the opportunities for partnerships among state energy agencies, unions, and utilities to train and connect workers, including gas workers, with new thermal energy network projects. And this is in alignment with the state's Utility Thermal Energy Networks and Job Act and an ongoing regulatory proceeding before the Public Service Commission. And finally, in this section, addresses the importance of aligning energy prices with policy goals, and in particular addressing the current low cost of gas relative to electricity. Next slide, please. With respect to workforce and market development, which is the fourth theme, the plan points to the importance of expanding New York's commitment to market development, innovation, workforce development, and leading by example in state projects. So this includes significant investments in workforce development in order to expand opportunities, training, and job placement support, again, with emphasis on residents of disadvantaged communities and other priority populations. Scaling up public awareness and consumer education through campaigns, strategic partnerships with trusted messengers, and also technical resources, and making sure that we have priority attention to residents of disadvantaged communities in that outreach as well. Supporting innovation and scaling up technology transfer, as well as in-state manufacturing and businesses that can deliver the innovative technologies and design approaches needed to decarbonize our buildings. And the plan speaks to this with regard to next generation heat pumps and building envelope products, grid interactive buildings innovation, alternative fuels, buildings resilience, and also low embodied carbon construction and products. And then the final theme is to transition away from the use of hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. So HFCs are a potent greenhouse gas, which is conventionally used in refrigeration equipment, as well as heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, or HVAC equipment, including heat pumps, and certain other building products. So this recommendation points to the importance of supporting research and development, education and training to support the use of more climate-friendly refrigerants, and to do that in conjunction with federal action in that space. and also to look toward rebates and low-cost loans, in particular for things like food stores in disadvantaged communities, to ensure that they can purchase and upgrade equipment as low-emission refrigeration systems become available. And that is the end of my slides. Thanks for the opportunity to go over the scoping plan buildings chapter in this deep dive fashion, and I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and the discussion.
Thank you, Vanessa. And as I said before, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our next panelist is Lisa Marshall. She's the Advocacy and Organizing Director at New Yorkers for Clean Power. Prior to that, she was the Program Director at Heat Smart Tompkins, New York's first and most successful clean heating and cooling community program. She has worked as a community organizer with the climate organization Mothers Out Front, where she built and supported multiple local organizing teams around the state. Lisa?
Thank you so much, Deb, and thanks for inviting me. So Vanessa gave a really in-depth look at what is in the scoping plan, and what I want to do, next slide please, is talk to you about what have we already been doing. I think I hear a lot of people talk about building decarbonization as if New York is a blank slate and we're just going to try it now because we have the scoping plan. That is far from the truth. We've been working diligently on building decarb and overcoming the barriers for quite a few years now. And I just want to make sure that people understand what we've learned and what we've accomplished. So we're coming into this climate scoping plan with a wealth of knowledge and data, of understanding really what it takes to decarbonize these buildings and what it will take to scale to meet the requirements of the climate plan. I'm going to show you some case studies. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the workforce development and workforce opportunities and make some policy recommendations. And I just want to say I am using some graphics and slides from NYSERDA. I do not represent NYSERDA, and NYSERDA has not written off on my presentation or anything that I'm going to say. So I just want to say that for the recording. Okay, next slide. So I was, as Deb said in my intro, I was the director of Heat Smart Tompkins, which became one of NYSERDA's clean heating and cooling communities. We were the first clean heating and cooling community program. NYSERDA liked what we were doing and decided to provide funding for other communities to have similar programs around the state, and also funded us for several years. And here's a map of all the clean heating and cooling programs when this was at its peak. So you can see that most New York residents were served by a clean heating and cooling program under this terrific partnership with NYSERDA. And what we did is we worked with residents and contractors. We gave informational presentations. We made sure that people knew what the incentives were, understood how heat pumps worked, helped them problem solve what their own needs were, and then helped connect them to a qualified and vetted contractor who could come and help them to do the work. Okay, next slide. So Heat Smart, these started when Heat Smart Tompkins started out, there were very few programs or incentives available to help people to pay for the heat pumps. And then NYSERDA started a incentive program with some rebates for heat pumps, which were great. And then right when I took over Heat Smart, New York State launched the Clean Heat Program, which is a partnership between NYSERDA and the utilities to implement a 5-year comprehensive heat pump rebate program across all of New York in every utility territory. And how this program works depends on the utility territory. But a lot of people still say it's NYSERDA rebates. It's not NYSERDA rebates. It's it's utility rebates, and how those work depends on what utility territory you're in. NYSERDA also has a piece of this where they work on doing marketing and information, and they help. There's a joint committee that between NYSERDA, the PSC, some other stakeholders, and the utilities that helps to keep tabs on this program and how it's working. Okay, sorry, next slide. So you can see that the money was dedicated to this program that includes the rebate program that goes through the utilities, the qualified contractors. So not just any contractor can get you these rebates. They have to be a qualified New York State Clean Heat contractor. You can find one in your area by going to the Clean Heat website and putting in your address. Also, you can find information about heat pumps and what incentives are available in your area. And those contractors are then submitting themselves to having to submit a scope of work with the type of equipment that they're going to use and what their approach is and everything before they get approved for that rebate for your home. So there's a nice level of comfort with the quality of work that you're going to get. And they also are part of this program. They have quality assurance and quality control and spot checks on the project. So they are that, you know, it's not perfect, but it's a pretty good program, and you can feel comfortable that you're getting a quality proposal and scope of work through this program. Okay, next slide. So what equipment qualifies under clean heat? There's air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, and heat pump water heaters. Heat pumps basically are a very simple technology. You all already have a heat pump in your house if you have a refrigerator. There's a closed coil with a refrigerant chemical inside the coil. When you put it under higher pressure, it condenses and absorbs, that gives off heat, and when you put it under lower pressure, it evaporates and absorbs heat. And that principle can be used to move heat from one place to another. If it's an air source heat pump, you're moving heat from the outside air into your house, or in reverse, you can air condition your house running the heat pump in reverse. With a ground source heat pump, you're taking the stable all year round 50-degree heat from the ground and doing the same thing, and you can both heat and cool and heat your hot water, excuse me, with a ground source or geothermal heat pump system. The heat pump water heater, this little guy on the right, they never get enough love, but actually water heating is between 17 and 20% of your home's energy use. So it's basically an electric water heater with a little heat pump on top. And that really improves the efficiency of the heat pump. They don't work in every home, but for the homes they work in, these are great pieces of equipment. And that is the one piece of equipment where you can get the rebate without going through a clean heat contractor. You can get it yourself. You can apply for it through your utility. And I think you can now get it at point of sale at certain retailers. Okay, next slide. So just a quick primer on New York's climate zones and whether heat pumps work in these climate zones. So these are the 3 climate zones we find in New York. This is not the same as your growing zone. This is similar to your growing zone, but not the same. And as you can see, the warmest climate zone is zone 4, the medium one is zone 5, and the coldest is zone 6. So we hear a lot of things about Buffalo and Rochester are too cold for heat pumps. That is utter hogwash. They are in zone 5, which is a very comfortable place for heat pumps. And most of zone 6 also is extremely comfortable place for heat pumps. Heat pumps are cold climate heat pumps. You can look up the rating of each one on the NEEP list. That's the Northeast Energy Efficiency something or other. I can't remember what it stands for. At the design temperatures, which depends on the climate zone, they're 200% efficient. In other words, double the efficiency of electric resistance heating, which is what people think of sometimes when they think of electric heat. And that stuff is very expensive and inefficient. We don't want to keep using it. And they will remain operational down to -22 degrees, most of these heat pumps. So in some parts of the Adirondacks where you might get to those kinds of temperatures, It would be good to have a wood or propane backup that you might want to use a few days a year if it were to get below 22. But for the rest of the state, a heat pump should be a completely adequate type of equipment in any decently insulated home. And the ground source heat pumps are efficient all year round in any weather, in any climate zone, because the temperature of the ground doesn't change all year round. So I just wanted to make sure people understood what we're looking at in terms of how heat pumps function in New York. And by the way, in a new building, heat pumps are really ideal because new buildings built to higher insulation standards are ideal for a heat pump. Okay, next slide. So we already have a terrific suite of incentives. I already mentioned the New York State Clean Heat Program. I wish I could tell you exactly what the incentive would be, but it is pretty complicated. It's different in every utility zone. And some of the utilities have changed what the incentives are over time. So it's a lot to keep up with, but I can direct you to resources where you can find out what it would be in your area. Last year, I'm proud to say we helped pass a $5,000 tax credit for ground source or geothermal heat pumps, which is a great help to those who are trying to install that highly efficient but rather expensive type of equipment in their homes. And we're the most proud of all of the fact that NYSERDA has worked really hard on trying to, and other state agencies, on trying to tailor existing programs for low to moderate income households to help them with electrification and heat pumps. These programs are still figuring it out. They don't work for everybody, but they are really great when they do work. So for moderate income, that's between 60 and 80% of area median income. Those households can get a $5,000 up to $5,000 matching grant. And for low income households, that's households earning up to 60% of state median income. There's a $10,000 grant, and for heat pumps, an additional $10,000 is currently available through the Office of Temporary Disability Services. That homes have to be Empower qualified and also qualified for HEAP. That's the Federal Heating Assistance Program to get that extra 10 grand. They also have to be heating with either oil, wood, propane, kerosene, or an extremely inefficient gas heater to get that extra 10,000. So I'm going to show you how this all works. What the income cutoff is. Okay, next slide. The impact of the clean heat programs, this is my chance to brag. You can see here by the different programs how many installations of either heat pumps, air source, ground source, insulation, and water heaters have been done. And there's my little program, Heat Smart Tompkins, right there. And you can see that we've had over the years been able to get more and more heat pump adoption, and which is pretty exciting. Still not scaling to the level we need, of course, but has definitely done a lot of work to lay the groundwork for what we're about to do because of the Climate Act. Okay, next slide. And this just shows some of the emissions reductions calculated by NYSERDA on the impact of these measures that we've taken. Okay, next slide. So, and I'm sorry about the terrible quality of this photo. If you want good photos, never ask heat pump contractors to take photos for you. I wanted to show you a few different case studies. There's a lot of crazy numbers out there about what these measures cost, keeping in mind that almost no households will tackle every measure at once. You replace a heating system when it's at the end of its life. You replace a water heater when it's at the end of its life. You can do all your insulation and air sealing at one time, or you can do it iteratively. So It really depends on the household, their income, and what's available to them, what is done when. So just when you look at some of the opposition's numbers that are set out to scare people, that's very rarely the case for an actual home. Okay, so this is a very large home, a pretty old drafty home. They got a full upgrade of the whole house, attic to basement on their insulation air sealing and a air source heat pump system, which after the clean heat rebate cost $25,490. Now, Michael will tell you next about the IRA incentives, but this same project would now cost even less with the new incentives that are coming down with the IRA. Next slide. Here's an average size home. When I say market rate, that's someone who doesn't qualify for income-based incentives. This is a more typical upstate New York home who got air source heat pumps. So the project cost was around $20,000, which is pretty typical. Then after the incentives, it was $15,000 to the homeowner, and they got this project installed in January of this year. So they will also qualify for a $2,000 IRA rebate. So their real cost will go down to $13,000. And they're, keep in mind, both of these homes are switching off of oil. So not only do they have this upfront cost savings, but they're going to be saving every month, but every year for the rest of the time that they have this equipment compared to their previous equipment. Next slide. I don't have a picture of this one, but this is a moderate income household who qualified for the Assisted Home Performance Grant, and the cost of their heat pump system was, quote unquote, retail cost was $16,500. What they paid was about just under $8,000. The idea of this program is to make sure that they wouldn't be paying more than they would for a high quality fossil fuel furnace, and that's, I think, about cost competitive for an old fashioned gas or oil burning system. Next slide. And then here you have someone who qualified for the low income grants. The cost of their insulation job was $0. The cost of their heat pumps was $0. And they had to pay $1,200 because they also got a sump pump put in that wasn't covered by the other programs. So we're really happy to be able to say that many households are able to get all of this work done at absolutely no cost. And I think not enough people understand or know about that. And that's also some of these programs, provided no cost heating systems, fossil fuel heating systems. And so the idea now is to adapt so that we can do the kinds of systems in these houses that are compliant with the Climate Act. Next slide. All right, that was a lot, but I could talk about it for days and hours and tell you lots of stories, but I don't have time. I just want to mention the workforce piece. So the clean energy jobs are a big part of our economy already. They are expected to go way, way up with the implementation of the climate plan. Most of these jobs are in the building sector, a lot of them in the HVAC and many in the insulation and air sealing. Nearly every company in New York is trying to hire and looking for qualified workers. And these are well-paying jobs with lots of opportunities for advancement. It's not just entry level and you stay there the rest of your life. And there's some studies that show that on average, clean energy jobs have much higher entry level pay and good benefits, and then there's a lot of opportunity for growth. So next slide. This is from the scoping plan. This shows, this is from the building sector. What we're looking at by 2030 and 2040 is a net creation of an additional 133,000 jobs by 2030 and almost 190,000 jobs by 2040, potentially, should we move forward as we must with the implementation of the Climate Act. Next slide. A quick little pitch for New Yorkers for Clean Power and many partners that we have gathered around us. We have launched an initiative to have events to let people know about all these amazing clean energy careers, bring people together to help overcome barriers and connect people with training opportunities, internships, and job placement. We have 3 events coming up just this month. Please visit our website, cleanenergycareersny.org. We'd love for people to visit, to table, to share the news with young people or people who are looking to change careers, etc. We think this is very exciting, and more needs to be done to publicize these opportunities. And I think the next is my last slide. Yes, so we work a lot on policy, and I'm not going to talk a ton about it, except to say we have some recommendations and some more bragging. Last year, we helped to pass 3 important pieces of legislation: the Advanced Building Codes and Equipment Standards Law, the Thermal Energy Networks Bill, and the Geothermal Tax Credit that I mentioned earlier. And this year, in order to really start to implement the climate plan, we absolutely must pass the New York Heat Act, the All Electric Building Code, and there's a very exciting opportunity to pass this decarbonization of state facilities. It's called Upgrade New York. If you want, I can put the link in the chat, where basically New York State colleges and other facilities would be decarbonized. And this is something that the unions are very excited about and are a part of. I'm going to say a quick word about the GAP fund. This is a recommendation that came out of the scoping plan as well. It's not called the GAP fund in there. I can't remember what they call it, but basically a lot of these lower income households cannot get these energy upgrades because they have a problem in the building. It could be asbestos, it could be mold, it could be lead, it could be not lead, sorry, that doesn't usually prevent it, sorry, old wiring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There needs to be a fund or funding available to those households to get them ready to do energy upgrades. And that's a very important thing for our equity goals as well. And this was already mentioned by Vanessa. There's a great need for zero interest and low interest financing. There is financing available through the New York State Green Bank, but we found during COVID, when for a brief time some zero interest financing was offered, that was very well received, and that I think is something that could really move the needle on helping folks implement these energy measures in their homes. That's it for me. I hope I didn't go too long. I didn't time myself. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a lot of information, but very helpful for folks looking practically and on the ground on this. Our next speaker will be Michael Hernandez. He is the New York Policy Director for Rewiring America, and he leads their efforts to influence state policy initiatives to accelerate the policy transition to demand-side electrification as the most tangible and common sense strategy for addressing the climate crisis. Michael?
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here today. Next slide. Just a little bit of background on me. I'm from Park Slope, Brooklyn, went to Buffalo Law School, and live in Albany. I worked at the Assembly for many years, and also at the Dormitory Authority. And then next slide. Rewiring America is a not-for-profit advocacy group, which is really focused on the demand side of electrification. You know, how can we help people move forward when they want to decarbonize their life? And we were instrumental in the passage of the IRA, and we created the IRA calculator for folks to find out how to, which incentives they qualify for under the IRA for their own purposes. I'll put our website link in the chat so you can access some of those resources. Next slide. And so just as Vanessa and Lisa spoke about, there's really four themes in the building sector regarding the adoption of zero emission building code so that our buildings will be highly efficient, zero emission, and will be constructed resiliently. And that's applicable to both to new construction, existing construction, and building benchmarking, so that we can continue to monitor and measure carbon emissions from buildings. We also want to scale up the financial incentives and access to low-cost financing for folks who are doing their decarbonization. We want to, the scoping plan also wants to move forward with market development, making sure that there are contractors and available to help people go through the process, access their rebates, find out about their tax credits, and go through the decarbonization process with them. And then finally, public awareness and consumer education on, what's the best way to move forward with your heat pump installation or your energy efficiency upgrades. Next slide. So as Vanessa and Lisa both spoke about, the building sector is the #1 greenhouse gas polluter in New York State. It's all of those individual fossil fuel combustion systems that we use in all of our buildings to heat our space and our water that contribute the greatest amount of greenhouse gas pollution in New York State. 34% of that comes from our residential sector, 19% from the commercial sector or commercial buildings, and then 33% from imported fuels and 14% from hydrofluorocarbons. Next slide. And as Vanessa and Lisa spoke about, heat pumps are the way to go to get away from fossil fuel combustion systems. There's both ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps. Next slide, please. Here's an example of various types of energy efficiency and building electrification projects that you would put into a new home, or you could retrofit an existing home. You can see in purple some of the electrification upgrades. You can install an induction stove or an HVAC heat pump or a heat pump water heater or a heat pump dryer. Energy efficiency upgrades, those are in orange, would include insulation to make sure that the temperature outside isn't impacting as much the temperature inside the house. Ceiling fans to circulate air, energy efficient windows to minimize the effect of outside temperatures, and smart technology. Also here you can see some clean energy features in green. Those would include battery storage, so you can store energy for later use, electric vehicle charging at home, and solar panels. And these are projects that will make your building energy efficient and zero emission. Next slide. We can also reduce our energy usage through smart technology or two-way data that needs to come in the future, where we'll be able to communicate with the homes and the homes with the grid, and that sort of technology will really make us efficient and smart with our grid use. Next slide. So at December of 2021, New York City electrified new construction. They passed a local law that basically said, after a certain point, all new construction in New York City will be electric. There will be no fossil fuel combustion systems installed in new construction. So this was mentioned specifically in the scoping plan. And it was an inspiration not only to the scoping plan, but I think also to Governor Hochul. Next slide. In Governor Hochul's 2022 executive budget proposal last year, she proposed that the building code be updated to require new construction statewide to have zero on-site greenhouse gas emissions. And so you can see the green text there. The governor had put in, the Energy Conservation Construction Code shall be designed to require new construction statewide to have zero on-site greenhouse gas emissions. So that was the starting point last year. But instead of passing that was not included in the enacted budget, but the legislature did pass in June similar language. It created a new sub 6, the same section of law, but it wasn't as strong of language. Basically, the current law provides that the Energy Conservation Construction Code shall be designed to help achieve the state's green energy and greenhouse gas reduction as further identified by the Climate Action Council. And so when we talk about the scoping plan and the recommendations of the Climate Action Council, specifically for new construction, the Climate Action Council said, Building Code Council, you must update the building code to reflect a prohibition of fossil fuel combustion systems in new construction statewide. So why did New York State pass a weaker electrification law in 2022? Next slide. Well, there was fossil fuel industry backers, commenced a disinformation campaign. They said heat pumps don't work in cold climates. The electric grid can't handle it. Energy bills will skyrocket. Next slide. And the fossil fuel industry has spent more than a decade and millions of dollars trying to obstruct climate action in New York State. Here's a report if you want to find out more about that. I'll put it in the chat. And then, so what's the truth about electrification? Next slide. So here you can see these are the projected numbers for the summer of 2022. And our capacity for energy generation in the summer of 2022 was 41,000 megawatts approximately. So, and then our peak demand on the hottest day where we needed the most amount of electricity was 31,000 megawatts. We keep an overhead. So between our generation of 41,000 megawatts and our peak demand at 31,000 megawatts, we have an overhead of over 9,000 megawatts. And we keep in reserve about 6,000 megawatts just for emergency purposes. So that you can see that we have plenty of overhead. With 1 megawatt of power, generally will power between 8 to 1,000 homes. And so New York State brings online approximately 40,000 new homes a year. So for new construction, that would create a demand of about 40 megawatts a year. And with thousands of megawatts in overhead, we certainly are not at risk for as far as generating enough electricity to meet that demand for new construction, which is a very small percentage of our building sector. 40,000 homes when we have approximately 7 million homes or buildings in the state. So you can see it's a very small percentage of new homes that we are adding every year. Next slide. Not only is that our current generation, but then New York will be adding 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar by 2025 and 10,000 megawatts by 2030, 3,000 megawatts of battery storage by 2030, and 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. The Champlain Hudson Power Express connection from Hydro-Quebec to New York City is scheduled to come online for New York City by 2026 and will add 1,250 megawatts of hydropower electricity by 2030. That's enough power for over 1 million homes. Next slide. So, as far as heat pumps working in cold climate, Lisa spoke about this. New Yorkers love heat pumps. In 2021, more than 21,000 heat pumps were installed across the state. The latest research shows that heat pumps are 2 to 3 times more efficient than gas or electric resistance systems in winter temperatures. Norway is installing heat pumps at a faster rate than anywhere in Europe, and Norway has the coldest temperatures. And Maine in the United States is actually installing heat pumps even faster than Norway. Next slide. And what about power outages? Many fossil fuel heating appliances rely on electric subsystems and so require electricity work. Gas furnaces on the market today still need electricity to power their electronics and fans so they don't necessarily increase household resiliency for when there's a blackout. But new technologies are coming to the market that will keep electric machines running when the grid goes down. Electrification, therefore, has the potential to increase household energy reliability as more homes install solar plus battery systems with islanding capability. And as more consumers purchase electric vehicles, they can be used as backup energy systems. So the car acts as a big battery and can power your home when or if the electric grid is down. Next slide. And then as far as energy costs will go down with electrification. Recent analysis found that that all electric buildings save residents of new electric homes an average of $904 on home energy bills annually. And much of the grassroots support for electric buildings is in response to the high costs of heating oil. Next slide. So, here we have some interesting charts that were included in the scoping plan. The reference is if we do nothing, the status quo. You can see the top left. If we do nothing, the consumption of energy stays the same from 2020 to 2050. On the top right, you can see that the fuels used to meet the energy demand stays about the same as well from 2020 through 2050. But if you look at the bottom left, our electrification, with electrification and energy efficiency, our energy consumption actually drops in half between 2020 and 2050. And then if you look at the bottom right, with electrification and energy efficiency, instead of meeting the reduced energy demand with fossil fuel combustion, we go from 20% electricity today in 2020 to almost 70% of meeting the demand with electricity by 2050. So with electrification, we will consume half as much energy as we do today by 2050, and we'll meet that reduced demand with clean, green electricity. Next slide. So in the Climate Action Council adopted the final scoping plan. It recommended electrifying new building construction as the easiest first step to moving forward in our decarbonization. Next slide. It recommended that the Building Code Council update the building code to reflect that electrification of new construction, a prohibition of fossil fuel combustion systems in new construction across the state, and to do so by 2025. So the scoping plan tasked the Building Code Council with updating the building code to eliminate the fossil fuel combustion within the building sector. Now, the Building Code Council is a statutorily created public body and is located within the Department of State. It has 17 members that make up the membership of the council. Most of those members are appointed by the governor from agencies and local governments. Some of them are from, one of them is the Secretary of State or his designee. And then there's also, with the governor and with the advice and consent of the Senate, 7 additional members who are architects, engineers, code enforcement officers. So they make up the Building Code Council. Next slide. Basically, the Building Code Council will take the model code that's issued by the International Code Council every 3 years and use it to make changes to the New York State Building Code. It takes the New York State Building Code Council about 3 to 5 years to update the New York State Building Code. Next slide. The Building Code Council is updating the New York State Building Code right now. They're receiving the 2024 ICC or International Code Council updates and making updates to the New York State Building Code at the same time that they're receiving those updates. And they're planning on voting on the updated 2024 New York State Building Code in September of this year of 2023. Next slide. Once they pass the updated 2024 building code, it will go through a year through the State Administrative Procedure Act, where they will get comments and feedback and make changes, and it will also go through an environmental quality review. So that process, the SAPA and SEEKR process, will take 1 year, and so by September of 2024, they should be able to have the final updated building code. It will take them a couple of years, a couple of months to update building code enforcement officers, and it should go live in New York State, January of 2025. Should be, next slide. Should be noted that in December of 2022, at the Building Code Council meeting, the co-chair of the Building Code said that during the meeting, that the Building Code Council would not update the building code to reflect the recommendations of the Climate Action Council unless the legislature did some additional legislative direction to require them to do so. Next slide. If the Building Code Council refuses to follow the law, the Advanced Building Code, which required them to take into consideration the Building Code Council's recommendations, there could be some remedies at law to ask them to consider that matter. Go to the next slide. And the courts could require them to consider the recommendations of the Climate Action Council. Next slide. Both houses included electrification of new building construction in their one-house budget resolutions. They're slightly different based on of when for all three. There's 2 phases for smaller buildings in the first phase, and then for larger buildings in the second phase. There's the legislature are in agreement. It should be 6 floors or below in the first phase. The executive wants 3 floors or below in the first phase, and there's a difference in the timeline. The Senate wants it to happen sooner in January of 2025. And the executive and the assembly want it to happen later, January of 2026. And so they will need to come to some resolution on that. And thank you for your time.
Michael, thank you so much for walking through what we need to do and what the Code Council will be working on. And before we go through a number of the questions in the Q&A section, and I encourage others to drop them in there, our panelists have been answering those questions, typing in the answers, but feel free to ask some additional questions. And I know, Vanessa, during your talk, you mentioned a few of the governor's budget proposals this year regarding buildings and climate. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about the Empower Plus proposal that the governor has put forward. And you are on mute.
Yes, thanks, Deb. You can hear me now, right?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I will repeat, because it bears repeating, that the scoping plan and the state's approach to implementing the plan place emphasis on policies and public investments to ensure that low and moderate income households benefit to this transition to kind of better, modernized, climate-friendly buildings. And this is really a critical opportunity to invest in housing and invest in communities that oftentimes have suffered from years of underinvestment and neglect. So with respect to the Empower Plus proposal in the governor's budget, she's proposed a $200 million appropriation, which would help fund NYSERDA's Empower Plus home retrofits program. So this additional funding would help 20,000 low-income families improve their homes by adding insulation, upgrading to energy-efficient appliances, and then some of those homes would further switch from polluting fossil fuel heating systems to efficient electric heat pump alternatives. As Lisa mentioned, the low-income eligibility threshold from Empower is 60% of state median income, and that actually includes over 2 million households in the state. So Lisa also alluded to an approach that the Empower Plus program is taking, which we've been referring to as an efficiency-first approach as shorthand. So the $200 million from the state budget would immediately focus on weatherizing homes to reduce their energy use, make them more comfortable for occupants, reduce bills, and make them ready for heat pump installation. Empower Plus will also continue to use multiple funding sources, and that includes ratepayer funding sources, federal funding sources, funds through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And then leveraging multiple funding sources will allow NYSERDA to also serve low-income households, not only with weatherization, but also with that heat pump upgrade when participants see their bills reduced from installing heat pumps. And as Lisa indicated, if a customer's heating with oil or propane or electric resistance today, they're going to see very significant bill reductions from installing a heat pump along with weatherizing. So that's the kind of point of emphasis from Empower Plus at this point in time. Finally, homes that qualify through the Empower Plus program also will be eligible for a new energy affordability guarantee pilot. So when they install a full load heat pump for heating and cooling, this pilot program will ensure that participating families will never pay more than 6% of their incomes for their energy bills, so that it'll meet that affordability standard that New York State has set as a matter of policy. So really excited about this opportunity to continue to leverage across multiple funding sources to serve low-income families, making their homes more comfortable, more energy efficient, and when it makes sense for the home, decarbonizing through a heat pump.
Great, thank you so much. Lisa, what are the first steps a homeowner or a building owner should take as they look to weatherize and decarbonize their homes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did talk about New York's clean heating and cooling programs, but actually what I didn't get a chance to say is that those programs like mine are winding down because we now have an even more exciting community opportunity that was a co-design between CBOs and NYSERDA. It's called the Regional Clean Energy Hubs, and these are just getting up and running. They now serve every part of the state, even Long Island, that gets exempted a lot of times from a lot of these programs because they have their own things. So I'm going to pop a link to the Clean Energy Hubs in the chat, and they're just getting started, so they might not have all the information at their fingertips yet, but they will. They have great people who are going to be able to, if they can't answer your question right away, they'll get back to you with the right answer. And that is definitely the way to go. We very highly recommend that anybody who hasn't had one gets a home energy audit. That's where a qualified contractor comes to your house and does takes a look, takes measurements, does a blower door test. Hopefully they also do an infrared camera to see where the air leakage is. But the truth is some homes can be really dramatically changed through weatherization, and some can't. Not all of them can. So we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And many studies just show that electrifying with heat pumps is still going to be beneficial, whether your house can meet the best possible efficiency standards or not. I live in a farmhouse that was built in 1840 that's full of holes, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. So, there's a lot of houses like mine in New York. And so we have to be flexible and on a case-by-case basis in what is the right approach for each of these old houses. New houses are easy peasy, very easy to electrify. And I'll pop the link for the clean energy hubs in the chat for folks. Please also, if there are elected officials on here, get to know your clean energy hub. Make sure your interns know about the clean energy hub. When constituents call you with a problem, connect with them. We do a lot of advertising and outreach, but the way that most people hear about the hubs or the clean heating and cooling programs is word of mouth. So anybody on this webinar, your word of mouth, make it happen.
That's great. Thank you for the information. And as we were saying, NYSERDA is a great resource for the residents of our state. They have the initial, they have a number of programs to help folks weatherize and decarbonize their buildings and homes, but they also are a centralized spot that can send us out to other programs that exist statewide and in our utilities too. Michael, how can homeowners and building owners find out more information about the tax credits, incentives, and other funding that's available through the recently passed Federal Inflation Reduction Act?
I just put into the chat Rewiring America's IRA calculator. And so you can put in your information into the calculator, and it will tell you, based on the information you've entered, what tax credits you will be eligible to receive. There's 2 tax credits that are you could use right now for heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and other upgrades, and including insulation, doors, windows, electrical panels, energy audits. Through the tax credit, you can get $2,000 a year for a heat pump for a heat pump or a hot water heat pump, and for other credits for other upgrades like insulation, you can get $1,200, doors $500, windows $600. I will put a fact sheet into the chat as well on the tax credit.
That's great. Thank you for that information. And I also have shared NYSERDA, the link to NYSERDA's page on there too. And the state is starting to offer different incentives too through our tax code and through our other state programs and our utility programs. So we have a few minutes left. I thought I'd hop over and see what additional questions are open. There's a question about incentives for folks in the middle income range and about getting insulation assistance. Lisa or Vanessa, do you want to offer that, take a crack at that one?
What you mean, Bill, I think, do you mean above 80%?
I think it's saying, a lot, as we mentioned, a lot of these programs are targeted for those which the state refers to as low and moderate income. And I think it would be folks who fall above that threshold.
Yeah, so I did answer it in the chat. I guess there's a couple of things. So there is a limited program called Comfort Home for insulation. You have to have a Comfort Home contractor, and there aren't very many of those. There are IRA tax credits now for insulation for anybody with a tax burden to take advantage of. So we do have that. And I just want to say too that one of the things that happened during COVID was we temporarily changed the definition of moderate income instead of being between 60 and 80% of median, it went up to 120% of median. And we were able to reach so many households with those changed incentive levels. And I think that what we're going to see, I don't want to speak for NYSERDA, but we are going to see the definition of moderate, I think, stretched under Empower Plus, or they were supposed to, I'm not sure. And I know the IRA incentives are going to have different levels up to 150% of median. So we're going to see, you know, I think I'm spitballing here, but I think I remember that when we increased the definition of moderate to 120% of median, that meant that in the area that I served, that 75% of households were able to take advantage of those grants. And it really mattered. I mean, we saw so many households being able to take advantage and use that shut down time as an opportunity to get work done. I started my job at Heat Smart as director the April 1st of 2020. And we were thinking, oh, all these companies were going to go out of business. The whole, you know, it was all going to fall apart. And for a few weeks, that was the case. And then due to a couple of different things, and in large part due to some really quick work by NYSERDA and state agencies, which, you know, usually quick work is not sort of their thing, but they really were able to turn around some things that instead of it shutting down, it was the opposite. We had the most households ever participating in our programs and getting these energy measures done. And we went from where we had initially been a program that was mostly for sort of early adopters, people with some means, people with a lot of education who were motivated by climate. That completely turned around. By the end of our program, we were serving a majority low to moderate income households, people who were looking to our program. Yes, they might care about climate change or they might not, but they were very interested in the energy savings and in just the improved home comfort, the improved health, the improved air quality. All of those things became very important to people during the shutdown, and we have a lot of great stories to tell.
Right. And I think that one of the things to stress on this is, you know, as we transition to an all electric future and we start to weatherize and our homes, I think the comfort level in people's homes will dramatically increase going forward. Vanessa?
Yeah, I put this in the chat, but we have spoken about legislative process today. I want to also note for participants that there's an active regulatory proceeding that's very important in this space before the Public Service Commission. So it's an interim review proceeding for the NYSERDA Clean Energy Fund and the utilities New Efficiency New York portfolios, which are for energy efficiency and building electrification. Stakeholder comments were just filed like at the end of March, and those were building on a report from the Department of Public Service staff. There's a pretty consistent emphasis on expanding access to weatherization incentives, you know, for New Yorkers across the income spectrum, recognizing how important that is, period, and then to get homes ready for electrification. So another important space to kind of watch and or engage in.
Thank you so much. And I think, you know, as we think about state programs, we turn to NYSERDA and the programs that they're running, or the ones that are run through the heating assistance programs. But our utility programs in our state are required to run efficiency programs and to run heat pump programs for that transition. So you can go to NYSERDA's website and they will direct you to your utility programs so you can access those incentives that are offered by the utilities also. There was a question in the chat, but I think, did Lisa answer that about how a contractor can become a NYSERDA certified contractor? So I encourage folks to go to NYSERDA's website and check out the assistance that's available for our residents to transition. And I want to thank everyone for attending today. As I said before, this webinar is recorded and will be up on the ACE New York website. And if you registered for the the webinar, the slides and recordings will be emailed to you. And I hope to see you at our next 2 webinars, or a deeper dive into the electricity and buildings chapter later in the month. Thank you so much for coming today.